Hi, I am Dr. Weiss, and today I'm going to be discussing the Renaissance and Shakespeare. And I have for you periodically through this presentation a little bit of music, some Renaissance music. Perhaps you've heard some music when you've gone to a Renaissance festival, and we're going to talk about today why the Renaissance is so interesting, why it's so historically important, what is its relationship to Shakespeare, and why it's so popular. And we see it this period of time in TV shows, and again, perhaps you've even gone to a Renaissance festival. The Renaissance period was a long period of time. Often when we talk about literary or philosophical genres, we're talking about 100 or so year periods. The Renaissance was from the 14th to the 17th century, so it spanned a long period of time. Over a long period of time. And these, as I've said before in previous lectures, and I've said many times to my own students, these are periods of time that are not finite. These periods of time do not begin at a certain date and do not end at a certain date, but are sort of movable. The Renaissance means rebirth, and it began in Italy, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. This is a period of time where European civilization, immediately following the Middle Ages. The beginning of the Renaissance is at the end of the Middle Age period. And this period of time witnessed the discovery and exploration of quote-unquote new continents, one of the things that I'll touch upon briefly today. The decline of the feudal system and the growth of commerce and of city-states. The Renaissance period was a transitionary period between the world of antiquity and modernity. And you had sort of a crossroads between Catholicism and Protestantism, the decline of feudalism and the rise of city-states, and individualism. So all of these things sort of working together throughout the several hundred-year period of the Renaissance. A variety of different technological innovations, of course, took place during this long period of time. The mariner's compass, the wider spread and use of gunpowder, sailing technology. And this is in the late 15th century. And again, I'm going to touch upon this a little bit in my discussion today. And I talk more about this in some previous lectures that I have presented. But sailing technology, which allows Europeans to travel great distances in the late 15th century and to cross the Atlantic Ocean and get to the Western Hemisphere, get to the Americas, South America, Central America, and North America. Some of these technological innovations include lateen sails and deep rudders and ways with which sailors can plot their longitude and latitude and calculate distances and those sorts of things. Again, I cover this more so in other previous lectures. And an important technological invention in the earlier part of the 15th century is the Gutenberg printing press in 1440, and I'm going to talk more about this later, which was really quite revolutionary in the spread of ideas and in literacy, the democratization of reading, and so on and so forth. So the Medici family in Italy during this Renaissance period had a vast banking empire. And they weren't just interested in accumulating large amounts of money, which they did. They were also sponsors of art and architecture in Italy. And this was important to them. They wanted to combine art with abstract notions of philosophy. They wanted to make cities beautiful. You know, today, if we are once again able to travel, and we go to Italy, and you go visit some, the cities of Siena or Florence or Venice, and we look at the architecture, many of the architectural visits that you might make come from this Renaissance period. And we say, that these cities are so beautiful. Why aren't our cities so beautiful? Was it about money? Was it about temperament? What was it that a culture was interested in that these cities were made so beautiful? And I would suggest to us, it is about culture. This period of time was about innovation, it was about beauty, it was about philosophy, and in particular, the Medicis wanted to create beautiful cities. Architects created the Renaissance courtyard, and there were drawings and constructions and formulas to how to create the best architectural marvels that you could. So for instance, I have a couple of images here of a courtyard. And scholars say, well, a courtyard should only be so big. You should be able to shout or yell towards, get the attention of a child at the other side of the courtyard. So they need to be sizable, but not too large. They need to have an arcade so that you can walk outside but not be exposed to the elements. They should have a fountain or some sort of central focal point of beauty that you can congregate and focus on. So this was a cultural undertaking to make cities beautiful. So the Renaissance marks the early modern period, a time of revival of classical learning and wisdom after a long period of cultural decline. And it was Protagoras who said that man is the measure of all things. And this became manifest in art, architecture, politics, science, and literature. Many years ago, several decades ago, BC, before children, and I used to travel to Europe a couple of times a year. Back when I was able to travel, tickets to Rome were $180 or $200 round trip. Ticket to fly to Paris, $150, $160. And on one of the visits, I did visit Italy and travel throughout Italy on one of my excursions, and got to visit the Duomo, which is an incredibly impressive cathedral. This cathedral was built during the Renaissance period by Filippo Brunelleschi. And this was technology that did not exist before. This was part of the innovation of different technologies to create a structure that had such weight to it, that had a dome that was so large. And so this was a project that took many, many years to construct and complete. And this was technology that had to be invented and tried. And it's a very impressive structure to visit if you have the opportunity. Alchemy, various sciences, and so over the next couple of slides I'm going to talk to you about some of the innovations in sciences, and these are going to sound very familiar, I think, to us, because if you are a student of science and in some of your introductory classes, you would be introduced to some of these materials, some of these people. Alchemy, however, not quite so modern. This was a kind of pseudoscience that existed during the Renaissance period. It was the study of the transmutation of materials through obscure processes. This was a precursor to modern chemistry. To find a method of creating gold, certainly all throughout time, people have been interested in money, in gold. And the idea of alchemy was to be able to change metals down to base metals, if you will, to transmute them into gold. And it was a common belief that there was an essential substance from which all other substances formed. If you could reduce a substance to this original material, you could then construct it into another substance, like lead to gold. Astronomy. Significant changes in science in astronomy. Previous to the Renaissance period, there existed a geocentric model described by Ptolemy in antiquity. And in this geocentric model, the Earth was the center of the universe. Well, this was replaced by the Copernican model in the early 16th century. And in the Copernican model, Earth was not the center of the universe. It was not the center of the galaxy, but rather the sun was, and this was called a heliocentric model. Renaissance science could be said to have ended with the beginning of modern science. It was also during this period of time that Johannes Kepler developed his laws of planetary motion. Now, Copernicus did not have the technology to prove, at least definitively, that the Earth was not the center, that there was a heliocentric model, until Galileo Galilei came into the picture. Galileo Galilei is considered by many the father of modern science. He made major contributions to the field of physics, astronomy, cosmology, mathematics, and philosophy, invented an improved telescope that let him observe and describe the moon of Jupiter, the rings of Saturn, the phases of Venus, sunspots, and the rugged lunar surface. And he, of course, helped lead the way to other scientists, in particular Isaac Newton. He was able to prove the Copernican heliocentric model. The church wanted him to retract his findings, retract this idea of the heliocentric model, that the Earth was supposed to be the center of everything, that humans, that people, that man was the center of the universe. Galileo did not do that, and he spent the remainder of his life under house arrest. Exploration. Christopher Columbus. Again, I've covered this in earlier lectures, but the exploration of the quote-unquote New World takes place during the Renaissance period, with Europeans coming to the Americas in the late 15th century. To put things in context, we have the Renaissance taking place. We have science and technology. We have people living together more so in urban centers, the development of European culture. And at the same time, we have Europeans exploring Central America and South America. Within 100 years of European exploration of the New World, quote unquote, 50 to 90% of all first peoples died, mainly from disease. So while you have this rebirth in Europe, you have the decline of first peoples in the Americas. In art, three major figures, and there are many more than three, but three major figures that I'll touch upon. I believe I'm going to touch upon three today. Raphael, an Italian painter, one of the three members of the High Renaissance Trinity. Pope Julius II had Raphael work on rooms in the Vatican at the same time as Michelangelo worked on the Sistine Chapel, known for the perfection and grace of his classical interpretations. One of his famous paintings was the School of Athens. What was an innovation in art was perspective drawing. And this was important because painters realized that if you reduced the height of elements in a painting, it gave the illusion of depth and greater space. And so we see a drawing here on the bottom that I just opened up for us. And if we think about perspective in terms of the School of Athens, we can see that there's a depth and that we move into the background of this painting. Before the Renaissance period, for the most part, and I think I might have an example coming up, art was flat and two-dimensional. And we'll see if I have an example of that. I do. In the lower left-hand corner here, I'll move out of the way. In the lower left-hand corner, I have an example of a famous painting by Giotto, The Lamentation. This is from 1300. And we can see in this image of the figure of Christ and those that are around him, that the figure seems more two-dimensional, as opposed to Titian's The Venus of Urbano, 1538, where there's a depth, and we can move from the foreground to the middle ground and into the background. Again, this is Titian, Italian painter, prolific and versatile artist who experimented with new forms of art, such as subtle variations in color. There's also a kind of unconscious sexuality here, that this figure is not self-conscious about her nudity. And often in Titian and in other painters, the human body is symbolic of love and lust and desire, and we sort of move from each of these different aspects, one to the other, that are explored in these paintings through the human body. Michelangelo, sculptor, painter, and architect, considered to be one of the greatest artists of the Italian Renaissance period, maybe of all time. He had psychological insight and physical realism. Michelangelo received commissions from some of the most wealthy and powerful men of his day, including popes and others affiliated with the Catholic Church. And when you get to a certain level of fame, I suppose, only a surname or a first name is used instead of your entire name. The Last Judgment painting of the Sistine Chapel. What's really interesting about, again, if you have an opportunity to visit Italy and to see some of these, the Sistine Chapel, unlike, let's say, the Mona Lisa, which is in, I believe, the Louvre. It's been a very long time since I've been to the Louvre. But most paintings that you would think are on a wall. And the more famous the painting that you go visit, the more people that are there surrounding the painting. So I remember many decades ago when I had an opportunity to visit the Mona Lisa, first I was confused as to why it was such a famous painting. And second of all, I couldn't see it. There were so many people around it, you had to sort of wait your turn with dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of people, to get a better view of that very famous painting. At the Sistine Chapel, and in my recollection, it was very, very busy. No need to wear masks at the time. But it didn't matter how many people were there because everybody was looking up. And so it's a very different kind of viewing experience. The creation of man, this is an aspect or a close-up of the Sistine Chapel Last Judgment. And from Michelangelo's Slaves and his very famous sculpture, David. Slaves and David are in the Academy of Art Museum. It's a much sort of lower key, not as ornate museum in Florence. And when you, at least when I was there several decades ago, it may be completely different now, but you walk into this long hallway, like you see in the image of the top, on the top. And you have on either side of this hallway these figures coming out of stone, and these are called the slaves, and there are 6 of them, I believe. And the slaves are various stages of a person emerging from the stone, that the human form is emerging from this sort of primordial earth-like medium. And then at the end of the hallway, the hallway opens up into a large dome, and you see the very impressive Michelangelo's David. Leonardo da Vinci. When we talk about the Renaissance, when we talk about science and art, Leonardo da Vinci comes into the conversation, often called the Renaissance man. And that term is because of all of the different areas of expertise, areas of interest that Leonardo da Vinci was interested in. He wasn't just interested in one particular thing, he was interested in all things. And if he was curious about something, he explored it, he investigated it, he created, he invented. He was an inventor, a painter, a sculptor. He was interested in architecture, science, music, mathematics, engineering, literature, anatomy, geology, astronomy, botany, writing, history, and cartography. He came up with working designs for the bicycle. They didn't have helicopters back in the Renaissance, but he came up with drawings of various machines, the submarine and military tank. Sigmund Freud said of Leonardo da Vinci, he was like a man who awoke too early in the darkness, while the others were all still asleep. Now, something for us to think about is that why was the Renaissance period so rich in art and architecture and in science? Was this a period of time where just serendipity created people that were able to do these things that were more extraordinary than any other time in history? And the answer to that, I think, is both yes and no. These people were not any smarter than people living at any other time, whether it's living during the Enlightenment or during Romanticism or during modernism or living today. These artists and painters and philosophers, they weren't any smarter than smart people or people like them during any other time in history, but there was a cultural desire for art, for architecture that was widespread, that people were interested in having cities that looked good. The Medicis were interested in bringing philosophy, and painters were interested in bringing philosophy and art to many people. I mean, how many people read philosophy today? I think the short answer to that is probably not enough. How many people are reading literature or reading poetry? Probably not enough. But during this period of time, emerging from what scholars say was a decline in European culture out of the Middle Ages, that people were attuned to these things. And this allowed the sort of flourishing in these various genres. The Last Supper. And again, here's the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa being a painting, again, that I've visited myself. It has been the subject of hundreds and hundreds of studies. It's been reproduced hundreds, if not thousands of times. And at last recollection, it was in the Louvre. Salvator Mundi, Savior of the World, sold recently in 2017 for $450 million. So these paintings by these very famous painters that came out of the Renaissance are culturally important and certainly economically important. So literature of the Renaissance, as I mentioned earlier, very important technological invention in the earlier part of the 15th century, the Gutenberg printing press. Up until this point, very, very few people owned books. In fact, very few people actually read. Reading was really relegated to monks and scholars. There were maybe 50 or 60,000 words in the English language. After the printing press, the number of words in the English language exploded. What did the printing press do? The printing press allowed for a printer to take letters, put them on a press, ink them, and make pages. What I'm saying is that books could be more or less mass-produced. So it did not take a scribe months, if not years, to make one book, that books could be mass-produced. What this did was, this was a democratization of literature. So the level of literacy in Europe increased. Up until this point, most books were written in Latin. Now books were written in or published in regional languages. Oftentimes there were no spaces in between words, and so now there were spaces between words. And this led to a proliferation of literature and its dissemination through a larger reading public. It changed the way people looked at learning, changed the way people looked at words. And this was important as we move towards a discussion about Shakespeare. In terms of poetry, you had the metaphysical poets, and one of the sort of primary examples of a metaphysical poet is John Donne, his Holy Sonnets and a valediction for forbidding mourning. And I'll read a portion of this, just because these are great poems. As virtuous men pass mildly away and whisper to their souls to go, while some of their sad friends do say the breath goes now, and some say no. So let us melt and make no noise, no tear floods nor sigh tempests move, 'twere profanation of our joys to tell the laity our love. Moving of the earth brings harms and fears, men reckon what it did and meant, but trepidation of the spheres, though greater far, is innocent. The metaphysical poets, more abstract, I would suggest to us. When we get to the Cavalier poets, you may have heard a couple of these poems. In fact, this is a very famous poem. Robert Herrick's To the Virgins Make Much Use of Time. Gather ye rosebuds while ye may. Old time is still a-flying. And this same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying. The glorious lamp of heaven, the sun, the higher he's a-getting, the sooner will his race be run, the nearer to he's a-setting. That age is best, which is the first, when youth and blood are warmer. But being spent, the worst and worst time still succeeds the former. Then be not coy, but use your time, and while ye may go marry, for having lost but once your prime, ye may forever tarry. This is, the very famous gather ye rosebuds while ye may. And I think that this poem fits into a long line, and this may be a term that you might be familiar with. Carpe diem, seize the day. Now, this is a poem about a knight who's telling a maiden that we need to sort of take advantage of the time that we have now. And again, this goes back, I think, it goes back to the first literatures of Mesopotamia, I think, with Siduri and Gilgamesh telling Gilgamesh, make every day a delight. And the Epicureans and Horace in ancient Greece and Carpe diem, seize the day. And today we have an expression, have you stopped and smelled the roses? Meaning that your life is so busy, have you taken enough time for yourself to enjoy it? Now this poem is a little bit tongue-in-cheek in that way, because this is about a man who wants to seduce a maiden, and he is saying to her, we need to take advantage of the time now, when we are young, not when we get older. Let's see what else I have. Richard Lovelace's To Lucasta Going to Wars. Tell me not, sweet, I am unkind, that from the nunnery of thy chaste breast and quiet mind to warm arms I fly. True, a new mistress now I chase, the first foe in the field, and with a stronger faith embrace a sword, a horse, a shield. Yet this inconstancy is such as thou to shalt adore. I could not love thee, dear, so much, loved I not honor more. Again, a very famous poem by Richard Lovelace. And this brings us to William Shakespeare. And there's so much to say about William Shakespeare. And for my students, and for the most part, when it comes to world literature, I'm teaching survey courses. We cover a broad range of different cultures in different time periods, different literary traditions. How can we talk about Shakespeare using one play, to talk about Shakespeare in 30 minutes or a 40-minute conversation, a lecture, discussion, and then again discuss one play? It's tough to do. William Shakespeare is really considered a giant among giants. And I have my own sort of ambivalence in some ways about teaching Shakespeare, because I remember back when I was an undergraduate student, my pet dinosaur and I, we had an upper level class on Shakespeare. And I remember my professor back 30 years ago telling me about how great Shakespeare was, and then we began reading, an entire semester full of plays. And I didn't get it. So how do I reconcile the greatness that I was being told of William Shakespeare with my own experience? That was difficult. The language is difficult in Shakespeare. Up until this point, whether, in my class, if we were reading Beowulf, or if we're reading Gilgamesh, if we're reading the Iliad and the Odyssey, these are translations. And translators, we're not reading Sanskrit, we're not reading ancient Greece. And the translators translate from these earlier languages into a modern English that is understandable, that we can move through. That is not the case with Shakespeare. Shakespeare writes in an early modern English, and for many of us, that is very difficult. Now, I do have a suggestion just in terms of understanding the plays of Shakespeare. And I don't mind this of my students, and I would suggest this to all of you watching, that I think that it is okay to watch videos. It is okay to read summaries. It is okay to go to Wikipedia. It is okay to go to cliffnotes.com or schmoop.com to get a summary, to get an idea of that which you are reading. However, I do not advocate that being the only way with which you read Shakespeare. If you look at the summaries, I mean, the first thing that we do when we read a literary text for the first time is we try to figure out the characters. We try to figure out the plot. And if reading secondary sources, albeit not juried secondary sources, but those sorts of Cliff Note style sources can help you understand what the plot is, then go back and read the play or the poem itself. That, I think, would be helpful. William Shakespeare is widely considered the greatest dramatist of all time. And in literary scholarship, there are only a few authors that some scholars spend the entirety of their life studying. And Shakespeare is one of them. So for instance, I teach world literature, I teach American literature, I teach a variety of different authors, both in those large areas. I have my favorites, of course, but I don't spend the entirety of my life reading one particular or writing about one particular author. There are scholars that spend the entirety of their life studying, reading, teaching, and discussing William Shakespeare. They also do that, and there's just a few of them. Maybe James Joyce is another one. He wrote plays over a 20-year period. Born in Stratford-upon-Avon, acting career in Lord Chamberlain's company, then The King's Men. There's been a lot of discussion, which really began in the early part of the 19th century, if William Shakespeare was the author of his plays. There was a group of learned young men in England, and they were called the University, some call them the University Wits, led by Christopher Marlowe. And these were playwrights and authors that were classically trained, read the classics. And so there was an essay published in the early part of the 19th century that questioned whether or not somebody like Shakespeare could have written all of these plays, which are, again, they were considered a masterpiece. They have been considered a masterpiece in literary history for a very long time. Shakespeare may have been the best person to have written all of these plays. Shakespeare wrote 37 plays in 3 different categories: comedy, history, and tragedy. He created over 1,000 different characters. And John Keats said, in the early 19th century, he characterized what Shakespeare was doing as having a negative capability. Now that sounds like a pejorative term, but what he meant was that a negative capability that for Shakespeare he was able to empty out his own ego in every single one of the characters that he created. They were all different. He created kings and queens and merchants and serfs and fools, and all of these different people. And this idea of negative capability, we don't see Shakespeare himself in all of them. So if you're a writer, and some scholars have characterized it this way, if you're a writer and you create a variety of different characters, it seems sometimes as if you yourself were in each of those characters, or variations of your own personality. That really wasn't the case with Shakespeare's characters. That each character was its own individual person, and that Shakespeare as the author knew how each of his characters would react and think and exist in different situations. Whether it was the sort of high language of a king or a queen, or the lowbrow language, the seedy language and jokes of a fool or a serf. Each of these characters were very, very different from one another. We know a lot about Shakespeare, and yet at the same time, we don't know a lot about Shakespeare. Emerson once said, 19th century transcendentalists, that the best biographer of Shakespeare is Shakespeare. We have a lot of information about Shakespeare's life. whom he married, he had children, he had brothers and sisters, so on and so forth. But we don't know a lot about Shakespeare's politics, his stance on things, because his characters are so developed and so different that scholars cannot identify, well, that is how Shakespeare thought of something. Shakespeare went to a grammar school. He didn't come from a high middle class or a high class upbringing, but he went to a grammar school and he did study the classics. He studied rhetoric. He studied the art of persuasion. He had exercises in learning how to argue for one point on one side and then having to argue for the point on another side. And so his characters are able to present various viewpoints, which sort of vacates scholarly attempts to understanding what Shakespeare's, the author's, position is. Rather, we have this very rich tapestry of various points of view. If his character is a doctor, then that character uses the language of medicine. If the character is a lawyer or a sailor, and what is so unique about Shakespeare in this way, all of these different characters use a vocabulary that is indicative of social status, upbringing, and occupation. So really, you know, and one of the things we have to sort of understand about Shakespeare and get our arms around, because at a certain point you're going to read a play and it's going to be like, well, I read Romeo and Juliet when I was in high school, and now we're going to read a Winter's Tale or Henry V or The Tempest. And that language, it's difficult for us to understand. So we have to sort of reconcile the sort of greatness of Shakespeare with the experience of reading his plays. So let me continue to talk here about language. And what scholars point to is some of the sort of, you know, great aspects of Shakespeare and his plays. During the late Renaissance period, a farmer might have 300 or 400 words in his or her vocabulary. The Hebrew Bible, in order to understand the totality of language in the Hebrew Bible, you might need to know 5,000 words. A little bit later, after Shakespeare, but John Milton's Paradise Lost, you might need to know 8,000 words to understand the totality of the vocabulary in Milton's text. For Shakespeare used more than 15,000 words. And these are not necessarily words that he all made or created anew, and there are a far number, there is a number of words that he used in new ways or invented for the first time. These words include addiction, arch-villain, assassination, eyeball, puking, obscene, cold-blooded, hot-blooded, epileptic, and what should be your new favorite word, bedazzled. If once you're allowed to go out and get together with people, use the word bedazzled. It will help you make new friends. If Shakespeare needed a particular word, he might have used, if he had a particular reason for using a word, he might use a word in a different way. If the word did not exist, he might have created a new word. Really, between the King James Bible and Shakespeare, between the two of those sources, modern English may have been created. If we think about the Elizabethan stage did not have a lot of props. It did not have set props. If you needed a table, you'd have a table. If you needed a sword, you'd have a sword. So it was important for the actors, and these were all men, it was important for the actors to use language to describe starlight or moonlight or storms or the greenery of a hillside. So all of these things were created in language. And these were things that the audience had to hear. A person that went to a play was not a spectator. A spectator is somebody who goes to a sporting event. Audience comes from the Latin word audiere, which means to hear. So you have to hear the words that are being spoken by the actors, and that sets the context. That tells you the scene, that tells you the objects that are in that scene. So language was extremely important to Shakespeare in order for the audience to make sense of the context of what was being described. Expressions, and these are expressions, I think you're going to recognize some of them. Expressions that sound like cliches to us today, expressions that come from some of Shakespeare's plays. For instance, wild goose chase. Let me see if some of the more common ones. Seen better days, that's an expression that I think many of us have used. Fair play, it's Greek to me. You've got to be cruel to be kind. Love is blind. Heart of gold. Knock, knock, who's there? Live long day. And the game is afoot. These are expressions that maybe to us almost sound like cliches because we've heard them so many times. They did not exist as expressions or quotations until Shakespeare. There are a variety, whether it's Hollywood or various festivals, where you can go see Shakespeare being played. Restaurants, and I think there was one, I want to say there was one that I'd gone to several times in Louisville, Kentucky, called the Shakespeare Cafe. And I think that's an image of it on the right-hand side. But there are cafes and restaurants and festivals. There are over, at last count, there are over 200 or so festivals, or there used to be, over 200 or so Shakespearean festivals in the United States. And hopefully we can travel again. Stratford in Canada, many years ago. I had gone with my significant other, with my wife. We went to Stratford, and in a 3-day period, we saw 3 or 4 Shakespearean plays. Some of them were period pieces, sort of set in the time period that you would think that they would be. A couple of them were modern interpretations in modern urban centers. So a lot of different variation, a lot of different interpretation. Why the interest? Is it only because of language? Is it only because I'm explaining how important Shakespeare is and that this is an academic pursuit to sort of marvel at the ways with which Shakespeare uses language? Maybe, but it's also the ways with which Shakespeare explored the human condition. That is, I think, the general sort of thematic enterprise of literature, and I don't know if anybody did it better or in its totality the way that Shakespeare did. It's difficult, in more or less, to watch TV. It's difficult to understand sometimes the things that we watch on TV without having an understanding of Shakespeare. Whether we're talking about from The Tempest, the Caliban figure, or quotes from Henry V in Star Trek, or the allusions to Romeo and Juliet in James Joyce's The Dead, allusions to various Shakespeare plays in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, in Planet of the Apes, in the Twilight series, in Harry Potter. The proliferation of Shakespeare, his expressions, his exploration of the human condition, really has been disseminated throughout Western culture. And here, now this movie I think is from the 1990s. It was the first Independence Day, and this was the president of of the movie Independence Day giving a speech before his fighters go and fight the aliens. And this is a speech that comes from, this is the Eve of St. Crispin speech before the Battle of Agincourt. And this is the sort of rousing speech that was given. And again, this comes from Shakespeare. that is given in Independence Day. He that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand a tiptoe when the day is named, and rouse him at the name of Crispian. He that shall live in this day and see old age will yearly on the vigil feast his neighbors and say, tomorrow is St. Crispian. Then will he strip his sleeve and show his scars and say, these wounds I had on Crispin's day. Okay, that is my, even a little multimedia here, Renaissance music. That is my presentation on the Renaissance and Shakespeare. Thank you very much.